Hello, and welcome to Felt Matters, a brand new podcast on all things felting, brought to you by the education team of the International Feltmakers Association. And we are your hosts, and both keen feltmakers. I'm Vivienne Morpeth, coming to you from sunny Lincolnshire in England.
And I'm Heather Potton, in the lovely city of Edinburgh in Scotland. Yes, we did. So I would like to say welcome to this episode. And I'm saying welcome because you've come into my studio and I love that. So
thank you. Very nice to be in your studio.
In my studio, although your studio is prettier than mine because I can see all your felt in the background. That's really nice.
I have arranged it especially.
Really
and I hope you notice that one of them is upside down. No, sideways.
No, I hadn't noticed. And I've got the piece that I just made the other day.
Yes, so, let's have a look at that.
I made an ombre, a very, very large piece of ombre felt, cut into 3 sections, and I laid them out on top of this big piece of pre-felt, this orange pre-felt. And obviously, if you've got the orange behind your felt, it is going to come through and sort of influence the color. But firstly, I think the color is just too solid. It doesn't have any variation. But the other thing is that the pre-felt, no matter how much you felt it, never has the same texture as your own pre-felts.
Well, I have different experiences with that.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you that the ready-dyed pre-felts seem quite solid.
Mm-hmm.
They're very hard to blend with your own blends.
Yes.
And they don't felt in the same way. I completely agree with that. However, I work a lot with white pre-felt and I dye it. So I just pop it in the dye when I'm dyeing silk and it comes out a sort of mishmash of colours.
Mm-hmm.
Not something that you would post on Instagram and say, this is amazing.
No.
But it felts then beautifully. And it's got these sort of different depths of tone. And it's still quite open and fluffy. If you dye it just very lightly, I mean, I just use a rice steamer and that dyes it lightly. And so it doesn't affect the felting. It doesn't make it more felted.
Right. Well, it's interesting because when I shared that with our team, our education team, and I got a couple of different comments. And then at the end of it, Louise said, well, it's a sample, isn't it? And I thought, this is a really big sample. And it wasn't the intention at all. And yet, in a way, she's right, because I was using pre-felt that I hadn't used before. And so I thought I knew what was going to happen. And it didn't quite work the way I wanted it to. And I guess that sort of leads us into one of the themes that we have for today's podcast, which is to do with sampling. And you had recorded a little piece where you're talking about the swallows that you made in hospital. Maybe you'd like to talk about that recording that you made at the time.
Thanks. Yes. Well, I made it when I was in hospital and it was a planned time in hospital. So I knew I was going to be in for a few days. And I thought, what am I going to take with me? So I was making these swallows into brooches. So they're really delightful little brooches, but they can vary in sizing as to how far you felt them, how I laid out the wool.
So I've seen them and some of them were, as you say, quite small and some of them were quite a lot bigger. Were they all using exactly the same resist or did you have various different resists?
Well, there you go. I am actually very impetuous and I thought, let's literally kill 2 birds with 1 stone. I'll make some slightly larger resists and I'll make some smaller resists and see which ones I like best. So this was me not sampling, not trying out an idea and just rushing straight in there and making maybe half a dozen birds with 3 different sizes of resists. And I have to say it was probably the middle size and the smaller ones that I think worked best. The larger ones, perhaps I could have felted down more, but they're probably more for putting in a hat if you're going to the races, rather than wearing on a jumper or a jacket. Whereas the smaller ones have come out really neat and they fit in the palm of your hand. So when you come to felting them, they're lovely and you can actually hand finish them and roll them. And so you get a kind of curve on the wings. So they stop being flat and they They sit up with a little curve. So I took some of them with me when I went into hospital during the summer, and I stitched into them, and I needle felted little beaks.
Right.
And so those are the details that make the difference.
And so you were saying that you should have sampled the decoration, is that?
Absolutely, because I am no stitcher. and I'm very inspired by lots of other felters who like to stitch into their felt. And I thought, I can do that. I had a good go, but when it came to it, my stitching isn't as small and as consistent. I pull the thread at a different tension. And all of these actually affect the finished result. Yeah, I should have sampled the stitching. To go back to your original question, I should have sampled the stitching on a separate piece of felted fabric before going straight into stitching my birds. Well, I'm just very impetuous, so I rush into these things. But I was exhibiting with a group of felt makers in a garden in North Yorkshire.
Oh, right.
And it's a Scamston walled garden. And they have a huge, beautiful exhibition space. So I was there with a group of felt makers. And I also had the opportunity of exhibiting with Liz Riley. And Liz Riley makes bags and scarves and many other aspects in felt. But what was fascinating was that she had these little pots, little felted vessels, small, that you could hold in your curved hands.
Yeah.
And she had these in her display alongside her bags. And I was able to chat to her about these. This made me realize that sampling didn't have to be a flat piece, a two-dimensional piece, but could be three-dimensional.
I love the interview. I love the chat. And I would really like to have seen what she does. But the next best thing is to listen to you and her talking now.
And I'm sorry, there's a bit of background noise because we're in a public space. And sometimes you can hear other people chatting as well as us.
Okay, let's listen.
I'm here at the Embracing Wool exhibition at Scamston Gardens. And I've got Liz Riley with me. And we're standing right in front of her beautiful work. And, when I think of your work, Liz, I just think of these beautiful designs and colour. And you create these bags, but you also create these little vessels. And you and I had a chat about that. And I was really interested in how you came about making those.
Oh, thank you, Vivienne. Well, initially I didn't use to sample. And I was always disappointed when I'd spent hours rolling and working the felt, and it just didn't work as I wanted it to. So I started sampling and using a conventional
making a flat piece to a set
sample,
size,
which is great, for shrinkage and getting the shrinkage of the number of layers. But I didn't feel it was representative when I was making bags to make the 3D shape.
Yes.
So I thought, okay, let's try and make something that's more 3D. So
yes.
I started with bowls, and I made a little bowl, and I can quickly make 2 or 3, changing the colour blends and the colours inside, because obviously, as you well know, it can change the colour of the outside of the bag. And I found that I was a lot happier with the final result when I made the bag as a whole.
And you're working with merino wool and hand-dyed silks?
Yes. So predominantly I work with merino wool and hand-dyed silks. And I quite like my bags to have a solid colour on the inside. And then my final layer of wool will be a blended layer. And when I wasn't sampling, I could be so disappointed that it just sometimes they came out like wishy-washy. You just didn't get the effect. So I started thinking, I've just got to get better at sampling and do this. And I do it every single time now. And you get a little pot at the end that's equally a nice little thing to have.
Well, we're standing here and we're looking at this beautiful bag in sort of mauves and purples and lilacs, and you have 3 exquisite little pots in front of us as well. So what you're suggesting is that you, in order to get a sample from a bag and to see, the shrinkage and the use of the fibres to make something three-dimensional makes quite logical sense, really.
You can see these two little pots.
Yes.
So they're made pretty much with the same silks pieces, but one has got a burgundy inside and the other is more of a, I don't know what you call it, maroony sort of.
Yes, I see.
So, but as a bag, they're quite different, aren't they?
They would give a different result. Yes.
So the effect is quite different. So then I can decide which I like the best, and if I don't like them,
and you said
that
further. Sorry, I talk across you. And you said that you made them relatively quickly. So what do you call quick, and what sort of size resist are you working with?
So the resist size on that is about
what's that about 10, 20 centimetres?
Yeah. And I also find it really useful in that certainly if I'm making a round bag, I can experiment or check the way that I'm laying my fibres.
Oh, yes, so the direction of the fibre.
To get a nice shape. So when I start shaping. So that I use really the little bowls for two reasons. I don't put as many layers as I would do in a bag. I think there was maybe 2 or 3 two layers
yes,
on
of course,
here.
That would make it quite bulky, wouldn't it, at that
thick
scale? Yes.
But I do change the direction of the fibres so that, especially if I'm doing something that is round, to get a nice shape to it.
So are you going diagonally at times?
Yes. So this one, they were made spoke first, and then the second layer was, I don't know, how would you describe that?
Like a racing track?
Round. And then I can work on getting a nice seam as well. And I apply the same principle then to when I would do a bag that was a round bag, if I like the result. So it doesn't necessarily give me the right shrinkage because I'm using different number of layers. And so I use it really for 2 reasons. One is the direction of the fibres, and the second reason is the colour, to get the colour. So I'll have a pile of merino wool and all the same silk, and I'll probably make 3 little pots, all with the same, maybe 4 or 5 versions of merino and a blend, and also the silk. So I'll make them all with exactly the same materials. And then see what difference, what the outcome is different.
That's fascinating.
So,
and they're just such beautiful, lovely, firm shapes. Because some people choose not to use merino for bags because you've got to really felt firmly to get a firm structure. But I'm looking at yours, and you've got beautiful oval shapes, beautiful sort of elongated shapes, and you've even got almost like a Gladstone bag, but it's a handbag version of that on a much smaller scale. So you've really managed to get form from merino.
Yes. I like merino.
Yes.
I'm not so keen on mixing, so maybe different kinds of fleece, because I sometimes find that you get the fleece comes through to the top. So if I put something that was a little bit coarser in there to get a stronger fibre, I sometimes find that it bleeds through the top.
Yes, and you can't shave it with Nuna felt, can you? Because you're damage the silk and the other fibres that you have.
Yeah. So I just work with merino, and it's a 23 to my 3. So it's just sort of a standard merino wool, really. But also I do use a lot of layers. So lots of very fine layers to build up quite a good, strong base.
So that's also very interesting. So lots of fine layers rather than 3 generous layers.
Yes.
It's lots of fine layers.
This bag has 6 layers.
Wow. We're looking at it's gorgeous. It's lots of blues and a very sort of bright, rich green. And you've got this sort of lovely oval shape, and it's got a nice firm base that holds itself. Yeah. So 6 fine layers.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so
with
interesting.
a little bit extra on the base.
Yeah.
Do
yes,
the work
of course.
a little bit around the bottom. So Get a soggy bottom.
Yeah. Well, on that point, just say you're so soggy bottoms. Thank you so much, Liz. It's been really lovely to talk to you, and thank you for your generosity in sharing your techniques. And it's so interesting to see sampling in another way, to see three-dimensional sampling.
Yes, and you get a nice little pot at the end.
Yeah, really
useful,
and they're just gorgeous. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivienne.
In our earlier episodes, we had interviews that Louise Kernan had with some other felt makers that she was traveling through Hungary with. One of them was Ellen Silberlicht, and we've already had a short piece from her talking about her voluntary work. But we also have an interview with Louise and Ellen because Ellen was the cover star for issue 130, which came out in March 2018 of our journal Felt Matters. And as you know, I love to dip into the archives, Vivienne. So
yes.
it was great to, once we knew that we had this piece with Ellen, then we started looking back through that issue to see who else had featured. And what was so lovely.
It's a particularly good issue, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
We found several connections in there.
Well, we did. And we went into the members gallery and came across The Broken Girls by Wendy Bailye. And Wendy is a very well-known felt maker. She's from Australia. She's been felting for over 30 years. And, I think a lot of people listening to the podcast will have heard of Wendy one way or another. And so we thought, well, she's got this wonderful feature here called The Broken Girls. So this was a mixed media project. But equally, we thought Wendy is the sort of queen of sampling, and a lot of her courses are based on just that thing. So the connection with Liz and then Ellen seemed obvious, that Wendy connects the sampling and also the mixed media. And what better way to do that than to talk to Wendy? So she came into the studio with us last week, and this is the conversation that we had. Have you two met before?
No,
we've not actually, but
no, we haven't.
I've
But
known of you.
You kind of
You
meet around you kind of feel like you've met, so many people. Because
I've loved your work for so many years.
Oh, thank you.
You're a great inspiration, and you're such a prolific worker as well.
Sometimes I honestly haven't made felt for about 4 or 5 months. Oh, except for this movie costume I was working on, but I haven't made personal felt. Felt that I just wanted to make. So I'm itching. I do have to do some. I'm doing the coffin lining for my friend this week. So that'll be a beautiful thing to do.
It will.
But
yes. I think that's I hadn't felted for a very long time, and in many ways the podcast has helped me to get back into felting. And Vivienne and I had conversations about how I felt a bit of a fraud, because here I was, working with her on the podcast and not doing any felt making at all. And you start to feel guilty.
Oh, tell me about it. I'm meant to be organizing a new class and making samples, and I just haven't done any of it. But I'll get, I know it does come in waves, and I think it's good to have a break from it and get back to it.
What is it that drew you to, when you started teaching, did you start teaching samples, or did you start teaching with project-based classes?
So in the early days, very project oriented, very, very project oriented. So I would have people come to my studio and they would have a list of things that they could make. I never taught a single project so much in a class. I would be teaching a bag, but people could make it however they wanted. So for me, the creative process has always been the most important part. So not limiting people's colors or, in the beginning. Just kind of working from a project, as in you can make a bag, you can make a hat, you can make a pair of slippers. Because I just think, I don't know, I've always enjoyed, so I'd often have a mixed class with people making different things. So I think I've always come from that base of wanting people's creativity to shine. And then as my work progressed, and as I've got older, I kind of recognized that I guess what my gift was the pleasure of sampling and how important that was for the more so for the creative process. And I think I've mentioned before when I've been asked about Sheila Smith and going to a convergence probably 25 years ago and seeing all of her beautiful samples that were so straight edged, and she had beautiful labels, and they were like flip books, and they were just so inspiring. And that was what really, I think, that gift that Sheila gave me was the gift of realizing how beautiful samples could be. Mine never met hers in beauty. I I tend to be just a very rough sampler. I'll do a rough sample, and with shrinkage rates and things, I'm quite specific. But with actually just what I'm sampling, I'm really happy to just do it. However, just to give me information and knowledge.
It's interesting that you talk about Sheila Smith, because virtually every felt maker who is worth their salt has some sort of reference back to Sheila Smith, who is responsible really for our discovering felt making classes as well. You know, the courses that we have online with the IFA, and you have experience as well, don't you, Vivienne, of working with Sheila?
Oh yes, and in fact, my particular experience is how she enabled me as a new mum to get back into felting. And she allowed me to go along with my maybe 6-month-old baby and bring the baby for the day to the workshop. And we made these gorgeous little Nuno bags. But that patience and generosity came through. And so you're working very creatively and very to a high standard, but also looking after the whole person. And it's looking after the whole person that is also required in a workshop.
You know, I was quite concerned when I started doing my online teaching that I wasn't going to have the ability to look after the whole person.
That's interesting.
And I have been pleasantly surprised that, I mean, we just make the best connections, and the stories. I mean, often in Zoom calls, someone will have a little cry, or, they're telling you about their life and their struggles with creativity. And for me, that's actually my live Zoom calls, which are really just a social thing. I'm not showing anyone how to do anything. People bring their samples to sort of talk about, and that's great. But it's actually those human interactions and those lovely connections that we all make. And they're kind of fleeting, they don't go forever. But to me, that's what being a teacher is about. It's about looking after that whole person and the whole experience for people, and to give them, if you've got beginners, I often just do a private Zoom for a beginner, because it's like, to me, that saves a lot of time in the process. And it's a really interesting, I've been so pleasantly surprised. It's been great.
I think for the IFA, the online, the sort of, well, everybody suffered over COVID, obviously. But one of the things that came out of it for us was the online AGMs, and the fact that we could get our tutors to record for us. And then we have these YouTube recordings for the members, which are there forever.
I just think they've been the best thing, the IFA classes online. And I've encouraged lots of my students to do those as well, because I just think, they're so comprehensive and they're so detailed, and you get such good service for such a reasonable cost. I think
That's right.
It's just been terrific. But, COVID did bring gifts to lots of us. I mean, look at us three doing a podcast with headphones and technology and cameras, and none of us before 5 years ago. I would have been terrified. And even just for me, like doing Zooms in the beginning, I'd be so careful and I'd be editing them all. And now I actually just don't care. Like people, honestly, I just don't. It's like, well, just skip the first minute, And
The International Felt Makers Association was obviously set up 40 years ago by Mary Burkett. And although it was called the International Felt Makers Association, it was predominantly based in the UK. And then when we started doing the online AGMs, it suddenly changed, and the membership now has changed from being something like, don't quote me on this, but something like 80% UK, 20% rest of the world. And now it's more or less half and half.
And that was always one of the things I said, and certainly when I got to travel when I was teaching in the UK, I had the opportunity to sort of say, we're in Australia, and, we don't sometimes feel like it's an international organisation. And that was sort of in that beginnings of when that was all starting to change, and it was so exciting to be part of that. And we've kind of had to work out ways that we have, certainly because we have such vast differences in distance in Australia, we've had to modify the way that we do things. So we don't do a monthly newsletter, but we give a newsletter maybe 3 times a year, and we have a Facebook group, and we do regular Zoom calls and little challenges, but we don't. We've got to kind of modify it because we can't actually physically get together.
No.
But
even within the UK, you can't always get together either. So.
But I think that's been one of the great achievements of the IFA in the last little while, has been that shift from being not so international to very international. And certainly, as you said, online teaching gives you. I had a lady in Bulgaria who did one of my classes, and she was using local Bulgarian wool. So we all got to learn about wool in Bulgaria. I mean, that's just astounding to me.
It is.
Just marvelous.
So obviously, one of the reasons that we've invited you to come onto the show, apart from just wanting to chat about felt,
yes,
is that there's a connection within this episode to the journal of Felt Matters. Obviously, started off as the journal, and now it's also the podcast. And in March of 2018, which is issue 130, you featured because it was mixed media, and your project was called The Broken Girls. So we wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about The Broken Girls.
Okay, well, it's a lovely little story. And it started in my studio. So I was down, my studio is under the house, which is where we live. It can be quite cool. I mean, we're in the tropics, but under the house is always a very cool spot. And it was winter, so it was very chilly. And I was having one of those days. It was miserable. I couldn't work out what I was going to make. I had all these things around. I just had no idea. I looked at my studio. It was full of what that on that day felt like rubbish that I had to do something with. It was just full of stuff. And a friend that week had given me a whole giant box full of her broken ceramics. So as I'm looking at this box of broken ceramics, I'm thinking, what on earth are you doing? You're filling your studio up with just this stuff that people are giving you, because you go, oh, don't throw them out, I'll look after them, And so I had this funny little moment, and I thought, okay, I've gathered this rubbish again, and I was feeling mopey anyway. And then I thought, oh, I'm really cold. So I went upstairs and I grabbed out of the cupboard my woolen swing coat, and it's a knitted coat that I just got at a charity shop, but it's a swing coat. So it's really quite heavy and weighty and wool. And the minute I put that on, I felt better. Yeah. It wasn't about feeling warm. The minute I put that coat on, I felt comforted. And then it just started me thinking about my journey with wool, and how wool is, I think, for me personally, the only fiber that gives such comfort when you put it on. If you have the right wool, it's got to be nice wool. And you put it on and you automatically just feel something that you don't feel with any other fiber. I mean, it's nice to wear linen, it's nice to wear cotton, natural fibers, but there's something comforting about wool. We all know that. You put a woolen blanket on, a woolen coat. So then that just got my little creative mind out of my horrible hole I was in, and I was like, oh, wow, I can put wool on these broken, and they were the ceramics were beautiful. They're by a friend of mine called Catherine Reason Macaulay, and she does the most beautiful ceramics, and they're figurative, so they're girls, mostly women. And anyway, so I thought I can put these broken girls, and I can wrap them in wool, and I don't know, it was all very mysterious. And so I put the wool on them, and I started rubbing them, and and I put them in cocoons, and I put them in little pockets, and it just set me off on a journey, and I just had the very best time in the studio, creating these little, and what they needed. Like, each broken girl needed something different. Some had bits of their head that were chipped off, or a little chip here and there, and I had to think about what covering I could put that would kind of bring comfort to these little broken girls. So anyway, so I ended up doing, some of them were just little tiny sculptures that I just wrapped and then put in their cocoons or whatever. And then others I did some wall pieces that were like a box. They were a felt background with a glass door that you could open or shut. And so I ended up doing sort of a mixed media work in the back of the box. So they were monoprints. And then I used all sorts of things. There was stone, there was wire, kind of anything the girls needed went in the box. But they were wrapped in felt. And then I had a wonderful experience at my exhibition. I had one of these broken girls on the wall, and this particular one I had called Phoenix Rising, and she was kind of an elongated girl. And then at the bottom, I kept looking at it and thinking it actually needs something, and I ended up putting some pieces of flint that I had got when I came to teach in the UK. And so I had a few of them, and I put the rocks in. I didn't even think about it. I just put them in because she needed that in the box with her. And then anyway, someone came and started looking at this particular piece, and she said that she'd like to purchase it. And I said, "Oh, that's lovely." And she said, "Oh," and I was just wondering, what the stones are that are in there. And so there was the flint, and then there was some other stones as well. The flint is the stone of fire. And she was Phoenix Rising. She was coming out of the flames, and she had the perfect rock. But I had not in any way done that consciously. That she had the flint stones. Anyway, the story was, so the woman was buying it for her daughter, who was in her late 30s and had terminal bowel cancer. And she was, she was just so devastated. But she said every year she bought her daughter something that would bring her courage for her, journey that she was going on. And and that's the one that she chose. So I ended up writing out, and each girl had a story that went with it. So a written story. And so I then, of course, sent her the written story, but I also put, with the metaphysics of, and also just the practical characteristics of flint. So that was quite kind of how they started.
It's interesting. It's interesting that even when you had created something that sort of healed these girls, you still called them the broken girls.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, that was how they started, but it wasn't how they ended.
And it was, the whole idea was everyone's broken. Everyone's broken. And so how do we all heal those broken parts of ourselves, of other people? And so that was always in the forefront of my thoughts when I was making the girls. It was very meaningful for me. That was, for my healing. It was like, we're all a little bit broken. But I was kind of being altruistic in my trying to fix all of these ceramics that my friend had given me.
It's so interesting how the way you've told that story, that this just fell into your lap, these broken dolls, but they've had such a transformative effect on your work. Do you see ways that that's carried forward into your current work? Or is it an idea that you work through a whole idea and then it almost rests?
It comes
unconsciously
to
bring it forward.
Exactly. It either comes to an end very obviously, or it has a rest and then comes back. And I'm still not sure where I'm at with that. Even just talking to you about it, it re-inspires me to go back down and look at them. And interestingly, at the moment, I've taken up pottery. on a Wednesday, I go to a little island off the coast of Brisbane called Stradbroke Island, or Minjerribah, is the Indigenous name. And it's about an hour's drive from my home. I go across on a little ferry and I go and make pottery for a big day until about 7:30 at night, and then I catch the ferry home. And that's my little wonderful thing to do.
It's very interesting that this whole episode is focused around issue 130, which was mixed media. And on the front cover, we have Ellen Silberlicht's raku pot with the felt emerging from it.
Yes, beautiful.
And the next part of this episode is, in fact, Ellen talking about how they came about. And she was a potter first. She was a ceramicist first, and then moved into felt making, and then combined the two. So I think there's definitely a connection between the two disciplines.
Pam de Groot was also a potter in her past life, a ceramicist, and you can see that in her work as well. But I'm kind of going the opposite direction, and I've really been using the pottery. Again, it's an interesting little bit of the story is, with my felt, I don't need to think about felt when I'm making it. My thoughts can wander anywhere and everywhere, and often go to the things that I'm troubled about, or it can get messy in my head when I'm making felt because my body just does the motions and I don't have to think. But with pottery, I can't do that. Pottery, I have to be completely mindful, completely focused, and also I'm being a student. I'm learning something new, and it's been interesting, and certainly that idea of making samples that I love to do so often, I'm having to do all the time with the pottery. And with pottery samples, you can't do a flat sample, really. You need to do a curved shape and put your glaze in that, because the curved shape makes the glaze run differently. So I've now got a beautiful collection of tiny, tiny little pottery vessels, which I think I'm going to use as little brooches with some textile in them. But it's again, that sampling thing becomes super important. I've really learnt with my sampling classes, and what the feedback I get from my students, the biggest and most surprising feedback was about failing. And at first, when my first student said it to me, I wasn't sure how I was meant to take it. And she said, "Oh, you've given me permission to fail." And I was like, "Oh, okay, I think that's great." But then more and more people have said that. And so that's something I focus on a lot. And to the point that when I actually did the videos for my classes, some of my samples were what I would probably consider to be a failure, but I left them in. And that was actually quite hard, because my ego was, as everyone is, wanting it to be beautiful and perfect.
Yes.
And I thought, well, who am I telling my students that you have to make failures, and then all I'm doing is presenting what looks beautiful.
Your best
so
work.
I actually left them in, and that was hard to do, but I did it on purpose. And I say that this is actually a really awful sample. It's aesthetically terrible, but these are the things I learned from it. So I think, as far as people who are listening, perhaps. I think the beauty of sampling is it does give you permission to fail, but you're not failing because you're learning such a lot when you do the sample. So I think I've just learned so much teaching.
That's so interesting, because you're giving people permission to fail is also giving them space to be creative, which perhaps fits in with what you were saying earlier, that people are really finding themselves more creative in your workshops because you're giving them that space. Because we know that scientifically people discover things by mistake.
Of course. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And giving them a bit of a slap about perfectionism, because they all want them to be perfect and they've not made felt before. And I'm like, honestly, why? But it doesn't look like yours. Of course it doesn't look like mine. I've been doing it for 30-something years. It's not going to look like mine. And, hopefully it never looks like mine. It should look like yours. It should always look like your own work, shouldn't look like the work of the teachers. And it's fine to copy work when you're learning to begin with. Of course, everyone does that. That's how you learn. But really, at some point, you've got to just grab it and do it in your own way.
And I think that's also the danger of project-based work, is that people just try and make exactly what the tutor makes. And very often the tutor wants that. They say, right, this is what we're going to do. This is the template that you're going to use, and so on. And therefore, you're setting students up to fail in a way, because you're showing them a perfect example, and then that's what they're meant to do as well.
And the interesting thing, and the way I ended up kind of on a bit more of a journey, was with my felt making, was I was asked to give a project-based talk at our local spinners and weavers, and I actually said, I actually don't want to do that. I don't want to teach a project. Like, I don't want to show people how I do slippers or how I do hats, or it doesn't actually interest me. It doesn't float my boat anymore. Whereas, 10 years ago, it probably would have. But now I'm like, nah, I've got more things I think to offer than to do that. And so I said, look, how would you feel about me talking about the creative process and how to make your work your own? And so that was really interesting. And that actually led to me then doing the IFA talk.
Yes.
And it was a bit of a risk, because I thought, are people actually going to even be interested or like this? And it was a whole new turning for my work, or the things I wanted to talk about. But it was the biggest gift. It was just, I was so glad I did it. And it just sent me off on another pathway. And so, yes, I'm with my sampling. That's what I love, but also just how fascinating the creative process is.
Well, we could probably talk for about another hour, but I suspect
we
that
better get on to the subjects. We shouldn't.
No, I think this has been a really interesting chat with you, and I'm really looking forward, because I can now reveal that I'm going to be joining you for your patterns and textures, your next class in April. So I'm very much looking forward to that, and we're just very grateful that you came and joined us on the show.
Lovely. It was very, very nice to be asked, and it's such a nice thing to talk about. And I really enjoyed listening to. I just enjoy listening to the podcast. I think it's a fabulous initiative, and I think you're both very brave for doing it. And
well, it was Vivienne's idea, so you can blame her.
Great, Vivienne. You've done a really good thing. I think it's fabulous. Yeah, just fabulous.
It's been such a joy for us, and it's amazing to finally meet you after all these years.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Heather.
It was particularly nice to speak to Wendy, don't you think? I mean, I'm excited because I'm going to be joining her in one of her sampling courses in April. And although it's online, I think it will be a fabulous experience.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, she's clearly a very articulate and brilliantly creative teacher. So you're going to have a ball there, Heather.
Yeah.
And it was just so lovely to meet her, wasn't it? I mean, here's a felt maker that we've both heard about for many years. And I've never actually met her in person. So it was really lovely. I mean, I know we're talking about in the studio and we didn't actually meet in person, but
no,
your studio is very friendly and cozy, and you feel as though we feel as though we're actually spending real time with, as best we can in this world where we're in different continents, spending real time with people and
our virtual world.
So it was brilliant to hear Wendy talk, especially about the creative process and sampling.
Yes, and in fact, she did do a wonderful video for our members, which people can still access on the website, about the creative process.
Absolutely, and there's even more there, isn't there, to pick up other videos. And there's more coming this year as well. But before we get into all of that, we've got another interview with Louise when she was in Hungary. She continued to talk to Ellen Silberlicht. And Ellen is also talking here in this interview about unfinished work with ceramics. She became ill and then had to spend time at home. And then she talks about how she combines her felting with the ceramics in order to finish a series of pieces of work that was just sitting there waiting to be finished.
And very much like the Broken Girls, sort of giving them just completing them with wool, which I think is always is wonderful. So let's have a listen to Louise and Ellen.
Can I take you back to 2018?
Okay.
And you had one of your creations on the front cover of Felt Matters.
Yes, I did.
I think it was March. It was certainly the issue number 130.
Uh-huh.
And I'd be really interested to find out a little bit more about the vessel and the artwork of felt that was sat on the top of the vessel.
Oh, well, that's quite a story.
Okay. I am sitting comfortably.
Okay. All right. Good. I was an art teacher, and it was 2016. The school year of 2015 to 2016. It was the week before school began, and I was diagnosed with breast cancer. I had enough sick days that I could take the whole year off.
Wow.
So I was very lucky.
Very lucky.
And because clay, I was at that point teaching mostly pottery, and the clay can have mold in it.
Right.
And with going through chemo, you have to stay as healthy as possible. And also teaching all those students.
Yes.
They,
The little
they can
infection
have
carriers.
a lot of,
Yep.
right. So I was lucky to be home. And I was also very, very lucky to be able to go down in my studio as I'm going through chemo. I felt well enough to do that.
Right. Okay.
That summer, I had thrown a lot of vessels, and I went through the raku process to create them. And I did not make the lids. I was going to do that at a later time. And in pottery, you don't do that because the clay shrinks.
Yeah.
And once the clay shrinks, when you go to make the lid, you have no idea what size to make it.
Of course.
So, okay, call me lazy, but I didn't make the lids. So I had all of these vessels sitting around. Now, the vessels that I make in this instance, they're stretched, and that's what gives it all of that texture.
Okay.
And so in stretching that clay, sometimes it breaks open. If there's a thin spot, if there's an air bubble, it breaks and it cracks open. A normal potter might say, oh, darn, and throw it back into the pile.
Yeah.
But I looked at it and said, ooh, who knows? And so I put it on the shelf. I fired it, and it sat on the shelf.
Yeah.
And that summer, I did a workshop with Andrea Graham. And I came home with lots of ideas of how I can use certain techniques and how I would use felt to come out of those cracks, to protrude out of those cracks.
Am I right in thinking that Andrea Graham is the artist that does the really wacky kind of creatures, figures?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
She does that. She also does beautiful pods and, but she's, these three-legged creatures.
Yes.
And in her workshops, she teaches all different kinds of surface design on her crazy creatures.
Yeah.
So I had lots of ideas.
Okay.
But since I was going back to school, I had to put those ideas on the shelf because I was getting ready to go back to school. And so then the breast cancer happened. So working in the studio, I did complete the pot that was in my head. But I can't say where the sculptural pieces that come out of the top of the pots came from. That was never in a plan. That was never, I can't tell you where that came from.
Sometimes it just comes out of your fingers.
It does.
And not out of your head.
And it came out
out
loudly.
Of your heart. Yeah, absolutely.
But I also, it came out, certainly. And I also had the time to explore those ideas. Yeah.
So when it came out and you looked at it, you placed it on top of your vessel, was there anything that went through your mind then about its creation, its shape? How did it speak to you?
I have the one that's on the cover was part of my, that wasn't the first one. And the first one was just, doesn't compare to the ones that followed, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But no, I just, nothing. Well, I have to say that the work that I do is probably inspired by Dr. Seuss.
Okay, yeah.
My work is, a little bit my work is humorous.
Yes, yeah.
A little wacky, very colorful. And I think it's all about joy.
Okay, yep, absolutely.
I think that's our goal in life. Everyone's goal in life is to find their joy. And I find it through the creative, my creative expression, with lots of color, with lots of joy, and lots of humor. I remember during the pandemic, I was ferociously felting.
Yes.
While everyone else I heard was like cleaning their closets.
Yeah, or decorating.
Right. Yeah. I was in my studio, throwing fibers here or there, making all these things. And I came up with an idea to make a Nuno felted pillow with birds attached to the top of the pillow. And I finished my first one and I stepped back and I thought, oh my gosh, I am cracking up. I mean, not cracking up laughing, but I'm going off the deep end here.
Yeah. Losing the plot. Yeah.
And I went to bed, and the next day I woke up and was like, if it brings me joy, then there's nothing wrong with that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's why we all make felt, to bring us joy.
I think so. Yeah.
Well, Heather, those interviews really set me thinking, because do you ever combine felt with other crafts?
Not really. When I first started making wall pieces, I did combine my felt with driftwood, which I know is sort of quite cliched nowadays. But I would get these very strange looking branches and sort of intertwine the felt with the branches and create these big sculptures that sort of stood away from the walls. The only thing I look back on now and think, was that my felting abilities then weren't very good. And I remember somebody very politely saying that my felt was very free, which I think...
Now, that is better than the compliment I had, which somebody once said, your felt is like cowpats. Which I took to mean it was too loose and floppy.
Yes. No, I mean, looking back at it, in fact, most of those pieces, the ones that didn't sell, and the ones that did sell, I was a little bit embarrassed about later on. I thought, oh my goodness. I mean, I've still got photographs from that exhibition, because I did an entire exhibition like this, with these wonderful pieces. I think the wood was probably more impressive than the wool.
But you live by a beach, so that would be a natural link. And there are quite a few felt makers who actually combine with driftwood and do it exquisitely. But like you say, it is about how your felted pieces are felted in the connection with those pieces.
At that point, the felt wasn't up to scratch. And I actually worked with, there were 1, 2, 3 of us involved in the exhibition. And, we had the ideas. We just didn't necessarily have the finesse. But that was my first ever exhibition. We had an opening night. I do cringe a little bit to think about some of the things that but then it didn't stop me.
We've all got to start somewhere.
You've got to start.
And
we have got to start somewhere.
Yeah. And it is a learning process. So the thing is now that you can analyze where you were looking back then, because your felting has presumably developed in all of the time since then.
It has.
It's what you're saying. Yes.
Yeah. And I made a lot, as it turns out, I made a lot of really useful pre-felts.
Yes. Yes.
Anyway, it's been lovely to talk to you today.
It's been fantastic to see you, Heather. Thank you for making me so welcome in your studio.
Yes, and we look forward to the next time.
Have a good weekend.
You too.
Bye.
Bye. This podcast is brought to you by the education team of the International Feltmakers Association. Conceived, hosted and produced by Vivienne Morpeth and Heather Potton. Editing by Heather Potton. Music by Artie Williams. Graphics by Rafaela Morpeth.
If, like us, you'd like to hear more from our amazing felting community, subscribe at the end of this episode. It helps other creatives to find us, and each episode will drop into your podcast platform for you to enjoy.